Welcome back to Parallax Views. See Derick Varn of the Pop the Left podcast for 0 books. If I sound like I'm in a down mood, I think we all are right now.
Yeah, it's this is the second podcast I've done today, and the first one was really low energy.
I think we're all feeling that right now. Coronavirus, I guess, is what we'll be talking about for most of this conversation. Maybe the elections, although I feel coronavirus has made all of that kind of feel moot at this point.
I don't know. I mean, I'm wondering how many Democrats are beginning to back off their Biden support as they see how just cracking under stress would be the non-ableist way to talk about it, but there does seem to be just a kind of incoherence, and it's not the stutter, and it's not his normal gaffing. I've seen him speak many times. The things that I've seen on the live stream since last week have been kind of baffling. But
can I comment on that real quick?
Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say, everyone keeps pushing this whole Joe Biden has dementia thing, and I know you won't comment on that, but all I'll say is, as far as I can tell, Biden has always been sort of like the Democratic version of George W. Bush. He's this aw shucks kind of bumbling fool.
He's a gaff machine, but he's normally coherent, just gaffing.
Right.
The last 2 weeks he hasn't been coherent, but it could, my also thing is, it could just be high levels of pressure. But I mean, it's worrying that while he can give a speech if it's prepared, basically it seems like the Democratic Party's whole move right now is to hide him during this crisis, and to keep him out of the limelight. And
I said that to James Carville on Twitter yesterday. He was talking about, well, it's over. We need to shut this puppy down. And I said, the reason you're saying that is because you don't want Biden to be sort of out there right now, given that he's not really coherent.
But Pelosi and the other Democrats don't want Bernie to drop out because they know.
I also mentioned that to James Carville on his Twitter. He probably didn't see it though.
They know that would lead to a fairly large Dem exit, not just of the DSA types. I mean, the DSA are only 50,000, so there's a lot going on here. There's also the split of the POC, the people of color vote. Not that there's a monolithic people of color vote, but this put the lie to it, because the Western working class Latinos were by and large Bernie supporters. Older black voters in the South were by and large Biden supporters.
I didn't realize that Bernie also had the majority of the Muslim vote as well.
Yeah.
Among Democrats, at least. Yeah.
Yeah. So there's a demographic shift, but Bernie did misread his working class support in the Midwest, which is huge. And while some of my friends think this is just kind of a narrative conspiracy theory to delegitimize Bernie, I actually think there might be some truth to the fact that a lot of the 2016 support from the working class in the Midwest for Bernie was insurgent support, and that is no longer true, where things now are more sorting by age. It's the same problem Corbett
a lot of people were saying it was hatred of Hillary Clinton in 2016.
That's Jonathan Chait's theory. I'm mixed on that. I think, to say that working class voters hated Hillary Clinton more than they hate Joe Biden would be interesting. But that kind of gets into the standard Dems cultural narrative about white working class voters. And white working class voters are more complicated than anyone's giving them credit for, including a lot of the quote unquote social democratic left, particularly their media commentators, who just are like, don't have them comment, don't have the left comment on cultural issues because it'll alienate. That line from Nagel that was first poo-pooed but now picked up by people like Peter Coffeen, not to call out, to call out names. I think that's paternalistic, and also from people who don't really know working class people that well. I don't think it's as socially backward as they think. I also don't think they're the working class as a whole, not just the white working class, is like super culturally progressive. I just think they can be reasoned with. Like,
I said that today myself. I said, maybe it'll alienate a few listeners of my show, but I don't think we should be like sort of throwing things like Black Lives Matter and trans rights activists under the bus. I think we can still work with working class people who may be more conservative. You can reason with them, as I said, but I come from Pennsylvania, so I'm around working class people a lot.
Yeah, and I live in Utah, and when I've lived in the United States, I've lived in red states most of my life. My thing about all that is I do think there's a anti-performative wokeness, not just amongst the working class, but in society in general, because that reeks of HR to a lot of people. But that's not the same thing as identity politics. That's a certain strata of campus identity politics that I don't think actually goes very far beyond it, even amongst people in like BLM or definitely amongst trans rights activists. I mean, that's a whole different thing. I mean, like, yes, if you look at the counterpoints, being canceled by Twitter activists, you would get a very different picture than if you're actually out and about every day. Don't confuse the mediascape and a lot of the foolishness there with, real people's lives. Not that that's not real life entirely, but it's not a one-to-one relationship, like at all. Now, we say this in times of epidemic, and who knows how this is going to be. I'm already seeing left-wing conspiracy peddling who are buying Chinese PR on this. That
Are you familiar with Francis Boyle?
A little bit.
He was I guess he drafted the Biological Weapons or Biological Warfare Act under H.W. Bush, but he was one of the first people to come out and be like, this was created by the U.S. to hurt China. He's a very interesting character. He's like a human rights campaigner and stuff. He's very involved with different movements, but it was a little bit weird hearing him come out and say that, although he did the same thing oddly with anthrax. So
a lot of these people are morons. The coronavirus is an RNA virus that's very hard to control. It's very hard to control with lethality. And it's very hard to keep within borders. Hint. Nobody who understands epidemiology would pick that as a basis for a biological weapon. Now, I'm not.
Yeah, I don't get the impression that it's a biological weapon.
I'm
Just
not
to make that clear.
I'm not a doctor, and I've heard all kinds of crazy things lately. Like there are multiple strains of the COVID-19. There are, but the differences in replication are minor, and so far they don't know that there's any lethality difference. Furthermore, it's been more lethal here than in most of the Asian countries. So all that like Asian targeted biovirus that I've heard from both left-wing and right-wing extremists don't fly. I've heard some people claim that maybe the origin of COVID-19 is the United States because A, that was claimed by one Chinese military official, and B, we don't know how bad the cases are because the testing is so poor. So that looks like we might have some kind of immunity. We don't, and we won't. We just don't have high levels of testing because we don't have the kits because some reason we botched that. There's all kinds of things to look at here. I've been in contact and reading a bunch of epidemiologists, but I don't work in the medical field. But what I can tell you is pretty clearly doesn't look to be a biological weapon. It looks to come from China in that it seems to have evolved specifically for Patagonians and then in bats. as the secondary transmission to humans. And Wuhan was not handled well by the Chinese until they handled it well, but they did pivot and handle it very well in the last 50 days. The United States has, from all reporting, kind of botched its attempt, even though it knew about it. But as soon as it got higher level officials involved, it became ideological and they were worried about the economy. And then Trump counter messaged in ways where he's always throwing stuff to his conspiracy theory base that gave them red meat. And unfortunately, that means a lot of boomers are not going to take this seriously and are going to die. This has led to a lot of leftists talk about somehow this is going to correct the things with Bernie, which is nutty. I mean, a lot of the discourse right now around this is frankly idiotic and annoying and not helpful at all.
Did you see that article in the Telegraph?
Which one?
The op-ed, Jeremy Warner. He was saying, well, this could be good from a purely disinterested economic perspective because it'll cull the elderly dependents. I almost get the feeling that some people on the left almost may believe in that with this whole
the cool
boomers must die, boomer remover, as the kids are calling it, type thing.
Well, here's the thing. One, it's kind of nasty even if you're over 30. Mm-hmm. Two, it hurts the immunocompromised. Three, I make those jokes too, but they're jokes. Like I actually, and I'm beginning to be more hesitant about them because, this idea that the only obstacle is Biden and the Democratic establishment's kind of diluted too. One of the biggest things that I've seen, even with AOC not really taking Bernie's side on this stuff, is that Bernie, even if he had won, would not have had support in Congress, which is what I've been saying. So while you might have some watered down Cory Bookerish faux Medicare for all that isn't that different from the Biden public option plan, I think mostly what you would have gotten from that Congress is messaging if the Democrats take the Senate back, which I'm not sure they're going to, because there's been so much effort put on the national campaign, which is something that I've been complaining about forever, is the Republicans have been able to, like, United Russia style the center of the country because no one's paying attention to those campaigns and assuming that everything's going to go down ticket off of the presidency or opposition to the presidency. Which might work for for Congress. It may work for the Senate, although the whole third thing complicates that greatly. It doesn't work seemingly for state representatives beyond the urban city level. And the DSA's building capacity was always in urban areas that were already really progressive. Mm-hmm. Right now we're in crisis mode, and we're going to be in economic crisis mode once we get out of this however long pandemic, which, it could last several months. One thing, even if it's, for example, we don't know if it's going to follow the other coronavirus patterns of being hurt by heat, although that might explain why it hasn't spread into Africa that thoroughly yet. And thank God it hasn't, because if Italy and Iran have really high death rates from this, can you imagine what Lagos or Cairo would have? Mm-hmm. They just don't have enough ventilators for normal pneumonia outbreaks if they get it, much less this. That's biblical plague kind of proportions. But we don't know that it's going to be that heat's going to slow it down. Furthermore, it could easily do a thing, because we have a globalized economy, where it shows up in New Zealand and in South America during the winter there, hangs out there, and shows back up in the fall. Which is kind of what Spanish flu did. That's what Spanish flu did, and that was a less globalized world than this. Mm-hmm. And Spanish flu is our only real related pandemic to compare this to. So, we could see 2 seasons of this, but again, we don't know. Mm-hmm.
It seems like we're in the dark about a lot of things with regards to coronavirus. I mean, just by the nature of it.
Right. So I was talking to a friend of mine who was talking about Daegu, where the death rate, like 1 in 300 people have the virus, which is still the low end thing, and the death rates, mostly people over 60, 0.8% died, which is still 3 times higher than any flu that we normally see. But the WHO estimates, based off Wuhan and the other countries, have it at 3.5%. The United States currently has a 5% fatality rate, with some areas being as high as 8%. But that's also true in, say, parts of South Korea that are not Daegu, where they have not had mass testing. Someone was telling me today that, like, Soyeon, which is right outside of Seoul, has an 8% fatality, but very few people are actually reporting the virus, and so it's only severe cases that are getting labeled, which is similar to the U.S. When you look at Iran or Italy was like at 3%. I don't know what they are now because their ICUs are full. So those mild cases of pneumonia that don't require respirators can become fatal in that scenario. So a lot of the things that would have been classified as in the 80% mild case scenario under the Wuhan study then become fatal. In Iran, we've seen this lead to fatality rate of reported from Iranian authorities, which we don't know what it is, about 15%. And there are mass graves visible from space.
They're being affected by the sanctions too, with regards to all of this,
which is going to make it way worse. I mean, like, that's probably why it is so high. They can't get any testing materials and probably can't get respirators, etc. But the other thing is we don't have enough here either. Even though we have the most hospital beds and the most respirators on Earth, if we really do see a 3%, or like between 20 and 80% infected and 20% of that severe, we do not have enough beds, even with the high number that we have in the United States.
What do you make of... I see a lot of people on the left sharing stuff about Cuba supposedly having a treatment, and I can't really find anything on that other than, like, Cuban state press releases. A
lot of the leftists right now are sharing counterprop or agitprop from other countries. Cuba has been sending doctors to help, and they do have a good medical system. But, like, I saw someone say today that they believe this statement from China that they'll have a vaccine in a month. If they have a vaccine in a month, it'll be a low efficacy vaccine. It takes a year to develop out all the DNA strains. Like, every epidemiologist I know, even people who take, Asian research very seriously and who aren't xenophobic, have been telling me that that's going to be that there's no way you can get it out in a month. Like, China might get an accelerated one out, but this sounds like PR to buy time to get a better vaccine. And high administration of an ineffective vaccine would lead to spread and would actually be dangerous. So, this sounds like PR. There's a lot. There's also a PR war between the United States and China for China to have legitimacy because it did botch Wuhan so bad so early, and was more concerned about its credibility. When it finally acted, though, it acted in a way that in the U.S. you can't imagine, which is setting up like total quarantine even for mild infections. And they were monitoring the mild infections, not to suppress people, but to put them into intensive care when they had a crash. We have nothing like that. We're sending people home, which is what they're doing in Europe too. And by the way, the social democrat, like Taiwan's handled this well. South Korea's handled this pretty well. Singapore's handled it fairly well. But those are the other things about those places. They're isolated. They might not have strong federal governments, but they have strong municipal governments. And it's easy for them to shut down their borders. None of that's easy for anyone like a place like the U.S. to do. Furthermore, we have prison populations and those detention camps, which are going to breed this like crazy. And we're not doing anything for them. And I'm suspecting like
Corona camps.
Yeah, I'm suspecting. Well, no, I'm not even talking about the Corona camps. I'm talking about like immigration detention camps. Those barely have water and don't have sanitation. They don't have soap. They're like, this is like, we were afraid of what the regular flu season was going to do to them. Add this to it, and they're not appointing aid to it. What do you think is going to happen? That won't stay in those camps.
Mm-hmm. I see what you're saying. Yeah.
I'm not worried about the Corona camps. I actually wish we had more of them.
Mm-hmm. I mentioned Corona camps because it seems like these ICE detention centers could end up being, because of the lack of sanitation and whatnot, they could just be a breeding ground for coronavirus.
Yeah, but I mean, people have been spreading, and I've spread the news too, that like they've set up, the military has set up the possibility of massive quarantine camps, because we might need them. Mm-hmm. We don't know what we're going to need. Social distancing will work, and we got it out, but we waited really late. There was already several thousand cases of coronavirus before we did. Now, if you want to feel good about, even though Trump, every time Trump has spoken in those two addresses, there's been things that were factually incorrect. For example, Google is not working on a nationwide coronavirus thing. Alphabet, Google's parent company, is working on a model that they're going to pilot in the Bay Area. What else? They had not authorized relief for relief of copays for even for treatment for coronavirus, just for testing for insurance, and they haven't figured out how they're going to pay that. I think that now is in the Democratic bill that just went through the House. I was just doing research on it. I think it's HR 6201.
I heard that bill is actually much more watered down than people would think it is.
Well, we were just debating that. So the New York Times ran an op-ed on the bill, and the op-ed clearly misread part of it, which said that there was an exemption for employers under 50. There is not. That actually just means that employers under 50 are automatically going to hardship deferral and tax rebates to pay for the cost from the federal government. That may be hard on them because it'll be late. Also, the length of quarantine was reduced from like several months, which is what you may actually need, down to 2 weeks, which is what you get if you're sick. Then if you're sick and you're not in a severe case, and in a non-severe case, quarantine is only necessary for 2 weeks. In a severe case, you can be in a hospital for up to 6 months, for up to 6 weeks, at least if the Wuhan and Italy are now our models. But we don't have those models. We also are so early in this pandemic in most of the places, we don't know what it's going to do. So far, most of the deaths here in America have all been the elderly. I think we're up to, New York had its first death. I think there are 39 deaths otherwise. Now, what I was going to tell you though,
is this actually only gonna hurt the elderly though? I'm hearing that that's not really the case.
No, it's not. It's just the elderly. The elderly are disproportionately the people who die. From the first round of studies, it didn't seem like coronavirus did that much to you if you were healthy. But if you had any compromised lung function at all, like I have asthma, you would have a high chance of having long-term lung function. Now, a focal study seemed to indicate you might have, 30% decrease even if you're healthy, of lung function for the rest of your life. So who knows? We don't know. I also know it has killed people under 30, but usually there are other complicating factors. So yeah, we don't know. Also, I mean, who knows? Like the Spanish flu actually mutated and increased in virulence on its second and third rounds. But again, this is not the Spanish flu. This is a novel coronavirus that we have no experience of that's related to SARS and has a much slower incubation period and a much lower fatality rate. I mean, if we were looking at SARS 1 level fatality rates, like, I don't even know. However, expect all this 2 week, everybody working from home, economic shutdown, social distancing to go on for at least a month if Wuhan is the example. And Wuhan may not be the example because even though they didn't take it seriously at first, when they did finally start taking it seriously, they took it more seriously than we have. So,
what about Italy? What do you think of Italy in comparison?
Italy's got what is happening in Italy may well kill the EU. And the other thing I've heard from people in Nordic countries is the Nordic countries aren't handling it well either. They're not testing. France is screwed. Boris Johnson is talking about herd immunity and just letting it play through. This is a novel virus. Herd immunity doesn't apply
That basically just means letting people die.
Yeah. Well, so like, we have Bolsonaro's whole thing where at least one of his ministers was infected. He's claiming he wasn't. There were multiple news sources that claimed that they had a positive and there was a fault. And now he's claiming that no, that's not true. But the mayor of Miami that met with him is now sick.
Well, how can you trust Bolsonaro too?
Yeah, because he was even more than Trump on this whole. It was a hoax thing. A lot of these right-wing talking points are going to go to bite them in the ass. But what I don't want people on the left doing is adopting counter talking points or agitprop or conspiracy theories to make up the void of official news. Mm-hmm. Like, we just don't know a lot about this, but I highly like when they're like, oh, COVID. Somebody was saying COVID-19 could have been part of the flu. No, it can't. A lot of flus are coronaviruses, but this one's novel. All right, it wasn't as
what,
it wasn't
what does that mean?
Out. It means that there's not it's not been in humans before. Mm-hmm. All right, and there are RNA mutation strains, but it's not been hiding out in parts of the normal coronavirus strains of the flu.
Right.
All right, coronavirus is a family of viruses that include a lot of common colds. All right, that also SARS, MERS. I mean, technically, this coronavirus, COVID-19, is actually SARS-2, acute respiratory corona something 19. All right. But we say novel coronaviruses because there's also already mutation strains in it because it's an RNA. There's just no indication that there is any lethality to it, and those mutations are not major so far. All right, because if they were super major, we wouldn't be able to test for them because it would change the DNA in which they are So, and again, I'm not a specialist. I've just been reading up on this like crazy for 3 weeks to figure out what to say. How this is going to affect politics, except for anyone there. A lot of people, even a lot of conservatives, think Trump is done. I don't know. I actually don't know that. One, we don't know how this is going to all play out. The $1.5 trillion injection into the stock market seems to have put trading back positive, as did all the public-private partnership crap that we were talking about. I'm going to talk about neoliberalism and globalization in a few moments because this complicates that. And I actually maybe want to talk about what neoliberalism is, because most leftists and most rightists and most normal people, when they say that, they actually mean ordoliberalism, which is no regulation at all, no government interference. That's not what neoliberalism is. Mm-hmm. All right. Neoliberalism is government-created partner markets, usually within states, and expansions of the market to other areas outside of states. Mm-hmm. So, like, charter schools are neoliberal policy. Mm-hmm. This is from Philip Morawski. This idea that it's just like open markets with no regulation just isn't true. They're markets often created by regulations where there wouldn't be markets before.
So I was actually having this discussion with someone recently about neoliberalism, and we started talking about the third way and whether that's like the same as neoliberalism.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think the third way is more government regulation, but no, it's kind of a variety of neoliberalism. So left neoliberalism is the idea is you handle everything through regulatory praxis, mm-hmm. right? And you still let markets pretty much decide everything. You just limit them. Right neoliberalism is to create markets where there is none, and to do away with governmentally provided social goods. Mm-hmm. On a global scale, what this means is mediated markets and labor arbitrage. Mm-hmm. So it's free market trading, but between unequal partners, usually Europe, the rest, and actually China at this point, because it's a big enough trader, can impose conditions that limit the productive capacity and whatnot of developing countries, and limit their access to technology, limits their ability to develop their own technology, removes their ability to control like internal cultural production, et cetera, and so forth. It's not truly free, even in that scale. So in this case, it's in the international scale, it's led to like unfair trade practices, some of which are also unfair for the United States, but a lot of which are just just pretty much bad. Like as much as like regular workers in the United States may be hit hard by some of these, because they remove labor protections and stuff internally. They hit third world workers harder. So you have those three things. I think that latter part of neoliberalism is going away. You have, I don't know how the EU survives this. You now have Germany talking about nationalizing its supply chains. You have, in response to this COVID-19 stuff, you have today, an EU court is putting punitive measures down on Italy, for Sardinian for not being able to recover Sardinian relief or something, which like during this crisis is totally inhumane. It makes the British look good. The EU has not been able to collectively respond to coronavirus either. It's been a nation by nation thing. So particularly with France, like admittedly the EU Parliament is where all the weirdo parties go in most of Europe. But particularly with France looking like it, with the pension stuff Macron did, making him even more unpopular, that it like Le Pen could actually squeak in.
So you said the latter part of neoliberalism. Just reiterate that really quickly.
So that's
we can
that
keep listeners.
That's that globalization and international supply chains. That part of it will probably, I mean, particularly like China's not being the world's workshop right now. But other places can pick that up. But you're going to see a lot of that decline, I think. I think it's already declining. There's been a nationalist mood in a lot of places. Even the left, in a weird way, the reemergence of Marxist-Leninism, aka Stalinism, which is still a very minor ideology as far as America and most of Europe goes, but its reemergence at all, as anything you would encounter on a regular basis, also has led to a reemergence in like nationalist thinking and leftist thinkers. And a lot of social democrats are kind of crypto-soft nationalists, whether they admit it or not, because they don't have an international orientation. Think about their inability to speak honestly about what they're going to do in abolishing borders, yet having nationalizing all these social functions, like it, and how can they deal with like capital flight? Yes, they can try to regulate their way out of that. That's normally what they try to do.
It seems like there's a lot of calls on the left to go back to protectionism.
Yeah, but there's always been calls on the left to go back to protectionism.
Well, that's true. Yeah.
But that was a left liberal labor concession, right? I don't know that even when you talk about the hard left, which is not particularly protectionistic, their ways about dealing with things are becoming more and more nationally oriented. I mean, like the DSA left the Socialist International. Now, admittedly, the Socialist International was crap, but the DSA did not propose anything or any organization to join it to participate in international stuff afterwards either. So where does that leave you? Well, it leaves you with a kind of weirdly national focus, and you see that in the fact that the DSA doesn't know what to do after the Bernie campaign. It really doesn't seem to know.
So neo-nationalism is on the rise.
It has been, even on the left, and the leftists haven't realized it. I mean, even people like Glenn Greenwald and a lot of people who are not liked on the left for kind of being weirdly honest and soft on Trump. They've also had a more nationalist tone to their conversations, but it's actually been across the board. Like, what people get in trouble for being too obvious about it. But the fact that like there are movements within the DSA to like reorient it internationally there, and yeah, everybody hates ICE and wants to abolish borders, but no one really wants to say what that looks like. Because abolishing ICE could be getting rid of all immigration controls, or it could be just moving immigration back to the NSA, which was still pretty brutal. Plus, that doesn't really do anything about customs and border assessments or any of the other major, like, it's not just that one organization. ICE.
When did ICE come into being? Wasn't that under George W. Bush or
yes.
No? Okay.
It's George W. Bush. It's it was created as a separate department under the Department of Homeland Security. Before that, everything was under the National Security Organization.
Yeah, I think there's this mistaken idea that if you abolish ICE, it would lead to like complete open borders immediately.
Yeah, no. Um, like that's why there are people on in the center liberal, not even like left liberals, like center liberals who are okay with abolishing ICE because what they mean by that is, put it back in the NSA, you can control funding. Its mission is not just one thing. But, it's not like Border Patrol was particularly brutal in the 80s. So, I mean, yes, having an organization devoted just to that one thing means that there will be organizational drift in that one area. And so, yeah, it would be good to get rid of ICE even in that superficial way, but like it's not what people think it means. So, but I'm also, like we're all, I mean, even I'm like, well, right now you got to close borders down. How long is this? If this is a long-term thing, how long are you going to see those calls? Like you're talking, like Trudeau is talking about.
It almost feels like the revenge of like Pat Buchanan.
Yeah. Well,
I hate to say that. I'm not a Pat Buchanan fan, folks, but
like you got to think about like Trudeau is floating the idea of closing the border down with the United States. African countries are banning Europeans because they're bringing because there are a few cases have been European exposure. Like borders are shutting down in Europe too from non-EU states. What do you think is going to happen if this maintains for a while? This might be normalized. And I don't think it's a conspiracy to normalize it either. I think it's like we were already like globalization and that rampant international capitalism, which was very unfair to developing countries, but did ironically bring a lot of people out of poverty, but on unfair conditions. Like truly free trade actually probably would have been better for them, but that doesn't exist. It's not a thing. So yeah. So that part of neoliberalism is gone. But let me tell you that public-private partnership stuff, that is not gone. I mean, we literally just watched a day ago the president of the United States, in response to a pandemic, call up as almost like underlings in his staff, the way he would call up people in the cabinet from Walmart, Walgreens, LabCorp, and Target. So that public-private blurring, which is not ordoliberalism. That's not unregulated markets. That's literally rentier. That's rentier rent sinking. Libertarians should hate this. They don't in a lot of cases. I mean, smart ones do. I shouldn't generalize about libertarians, but they should, on principle, hate this. This has all the moral hazard that you would expect of what they worry about government intervention for, with none of the accountability.
I don't want to interrupt you because you're on a roll, but I hear that term rent seeking a lot, and I still am like kind of fuzzy on what it's referring to, and like I've never been able to get like a clear definition of it. I'm sure there is one. That's why I'm sort of asking you to maybe guide me a little bit.
Okay, so rent-seeking or rentier practices, as we Marxists call it, is this idea that you use monopoly powers to form captive markets where you can compel payments, such as like in insurance markets, or through property liens and housing. Like property is all rentier stuff. It's not a commodity. What you produce with property is a commodity, but the property itself, which is wealth in the Marxist term, like we have distinctions from that, is not that. How can you compel people to pay for that? Through force. But the force of law is subtle. All right. So like IP is rent seeking. Another way of rent seeking is getting rents from tax farming, which is when you do public-private partnerships. That's a captive market where you negotiate with one party. There's no market pressures or downward price pressures because of that. So the normal tendency of profits to decline doesn't really apply, and that's not good because that's still the base of the economy. Hold on one second.
Yeah, no problem.
That's still the base of the economy. So so the commodity markets like oil, for example, is this, but all these IP things is why prices don't really reflect, like, from my understanding of value theory anyway, is why prices don't really reflect that. Rent seeking is where you can find rents from a captive market, and the best captive market is a government contract. All right. Now, this is weirdly where like Marxists and libertarians actually agree against liberals. We see this as a problem, particularly when you're dealing with public-private partnerships, because at least when you're dealing with government things and you have a democratic society, there's a democratic check on those government offices, and there's complete controls on, like, that's tied into the same people who can do monetary flows. All right. Even if the Fed's private, really, you can tie that in. Whereas if you're dealing with private things, you're moving large monetary flows in the private sector where there are no democratic oversights generally, and they're beholden not to the public but to stock options most of the time. So, like, yes, there's all the private innovation, which I'm not even going to say is not real, but you have all these countervailing things where these profits don't get, like, reinvested into what they're supposed to do. So, for example, the only way a lot of these public-private partnerships can make money, because they're in areas that are not commodity producing, is to somehow make the production of it cheaper. So you see a decline in staff, you see increases in, you see decreases in pay below living wage rates, and all that, because the only way to make money off of those public-private partnerships is to skim off the top over time.
I see.
If it actually is a labor producing, a highly labor centric thing, like education's highly, like, they have not figured out a way to cut the labor down in education. So you have a lot of graft. The weird thing about these public-private partnerships, though, is since they're highly regulated, they also end up creating tons of administrative bloat. You see this in schools. You see this in healthcare in the United States. So you have this exploding of cost for administration. My favorite example is, while, yes, there have been variances in funding up and down overall, in individual states for education, you've seen a 300% increase in education spending per student in the past 3 decades. 300% increase in education spending per student in the past 3 decades. That's a lot.
Yeah, that's crazy.
91% of all school budgets goes into facilities and staff, mostly staff. But real wages of staff, thus real cost of staff, has gone down for teachers and hourly staff, educational support professionals. Where's all that money going?
Right. I see
going into administration.
Right.
That is true. That is obvious in universities, but you see more outrage about it in universities because it's not hidden behind a tax bill. Now, again, I sound like a libertarian on this. I'm not. But I just want to, like, point this out. So this is what this public-private partnership leads to. I don't see anything in the United States telling me that that's going to stop in the next few years. And Keynesian policies can work with neoliberalism at a point. All right. So how did pre-Keynesian and Keynesian policies work? Pre-Keynesian policies were tied with pretty much ordoliberalism. When that failed, in Germany you had Schachtism, and in the United States you had New Dealism. Those are actually pre-Keynesian policies. Keynes hadn't come up with his general theory yet, where you do public works to make up the difference, to kind of eat the slack as a kind of jobs guarantee. Keynesianism indicates that you can use a monetary trick to kind of keep that going, to keep that public
right.
works. That's really where Keynesian innovation comes from. That's not modern monetary theory, which basically says you can just, print money indefinitely, and because it has liquidity value. I might be being unfair, but that basically, as long as there's consumption, you can eat that without and you don't flush it all at once, you can control, you can kind of counterplay against the business cycle by doing this. We don't really know if that works because no country's really done it except the imperial powers, but we don't know if that's because their ability to control international markets by force.
Right, they're hegemonic.
Yeah. Right. Or if it's because this theory of money is true universally. All right? We don't know that. Most MMTers, when you point out that small states can't do this, say it's because they peg their currencies to the dollar. Well, the reason why they peg their currencies to the dollar is because they have to buy stuff on an international market. But it is true that governments don't run out of money once you're off the gold standard. That is true. I mean, like a check written even in the most inflated economy is still technically solvent. It's just what can that purchase outside of the country?
I see.
So but Keynesianism isn't that. Keynesianism is related to that. What they say is during downturns you should spend because you can basically inflate your way out of debt, and then you should restrict the monetary supply and also public works when the private sector can kind of eat it up. Although Keynes thought, basically did have some socialist ideas written in that. He actually hated Marxism and didn't like workers' control of things. He thought
wasn't he sort of like one of the elites? He was just like, we should give a few scraps to the plebs.
Well, I mean, yeah, but a lot of Keynes's predictions are wrong. Stagflation happened. Now, a lot of Keynesians and post-Keynesians now will tell you that was because of an oil shock, but I'm always like, well, if you can't survive a commodity shock, then how can you, deal with then that credit against your theory. And the other problem is that stagflation really did seem to throw everything off, and that's so the other problem, excuse me, I'm losing my track here. The other problem with Keynesianism is that under Keynesian theory, you are supposed to eventually eat up some of that surplus back into the system in good times. That never happens.
Okay, I see.
So what you have is deficit spending. If you don't have a large access to an international market, that will eventually collapse your currency. If you do, then you seem to be able to do just fine, except commodity prices still trend downward. All right, they still follow that classical economic, which that's not just Marxism, but also Smithianism, Ricardianism model of commodity prices trending down. You see this with oil, and it's not even based on scarcity. Like there's actually a tendency to, when historically speaking on commodities, when right before they start to run out, to flood the market with them, to try to get as much from them as you can before they're not valuable. Which actually drops the price, even though ironically they're going to become more scarce in the future. Which worries you about this current oil pumping, right? Maybe it should.
Right.
Peak oilers may be wrong in their Malthusian economics, but what they might not be wrong is we might really be at an end to easily findable cheap oil.
Can I comment on that real quick?
Yeah.
My understanding of peak oil, at least from people like Chris Nadler who would talk about it, is that the claim was never necessary, and maybe they were changing the goalposts a bit when people like Nadler said this, but my understanding was that it's not about running out of oil. It's about the cost of getting it outweighing the
benefit.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and if you look at tar sands and shell, that's a more cost. That's a more cost heavy. It's a more cost heavy procedure, but a lot of the cost is in externalities that companies will pay for. It's a general externality, which is kind of a problem.
What do you make of this oil war with Saudi Arabia and Russia? I see a lot of centrists, that watch MSNBC being very, very confused right now. They're like, well, why is Putin doing this if it hurts Trump?
Yeah, people are dumb.
I know you just don't have any time for that.
No, I mean, like, Russia's geostrategic interest is having a slightly more friendly president in the White House. So yeah, but in general, all Russia really has is its nuclear arsenal and its ability to cause chaos.
Mm-hmm.
It's not a super strong economy.
Mm-hmm.
It's already been damaged by the trending of oil prices downward, which is not going to stop in the near future, even if there's less oil. All right. And again, I think Marxist theory of commodity prices explains this better than general economics does, because from general economics, the scarcity should make oil cheaper, right? But it doesn't. Mm-hmm. And that's actually true for most commodities until the commodity is almost gone, and then the price skyrockets up. Mm-hmm. You see that with like copper and tin. You can see that with classical commodities. Commodity prices tend down until they're so rare that they're not really commodities anymore. Mm-hmm. They're not general commodities anyway. And you see that with food, which is why so many governments buoy their food markets. Mm-hmm. But anyway, so what does that mean for Russian geostrategic interests? Russia geostrategic interest has is going, since it can't benefit from OPEC anymore. Mm-hmm. It doesn't have any reason not to flood the market to kind of at least weaken its competition. Mm-hmm. It isn't really going to it's not going to benefit from oil now much regardless. So to flood the market to at least weaken its strategic enemies, of which U.S. is still kind of one, mm-hmm. And which Saudi Arabia is definitely another, mm-hmm. Is actually a point of power. Mm-hmm. And since Venezuela and all that are already out of commission and Russia can't make much hay with that, this is its best lever. It no longer has the other levers in the oil producing countries to pull, because the largest oil producer is now us in Canada.
What exactly led to the breakdown between U.S. and Russian relations? Because I know for a while there was the whole Russian reset with Obama. People forget about that. But, the Obama administration at first was reticent about things like the Magnitsky Act. Right. Very early on. We sort of ignore that now because it doesn't fit the narrative of
I think part of it
Russian
is
Democrats.
like the Medvedev period of the Atlantic-centric period of Putin. I think a lot of it has to do with internal Russian politics. No, Russia's not run by Duginist, followers of Alexander Dugin, which no one knew about till recently and was way out of power by the time people did. But there were two factions in the United Russia front. So one of the interesting things about when you make your government pretty much one party is multiple factions of that party emerge. Putin was playing factions against each other. There's these like Eurasian centric factions, and there's these Atlanticist friendly factions. And Medvedev, the former president and Putin's chosen successor for a while, was actually of the Atlanticist faction. Mm-hmm. When Putin kept back in control, he felt like maybe that faction got a little bit too powerful within United Russia and started to pull back, particularly as commodity prices dropped and their advantage in trade started to decline. So then where Russia's real advantage in trade is after oil is in weapons. So there you go. They also needed to get more cozy with China. Even though there's a lot of people think that Russia and China are in the United Bloc, they thought that in the BRICS years too. That's not true. They're frenemies in the way that like we kind of are frenemies with the non-UK part of the, well, they're not in the UK. UK's not in it anymore anyway. But the non-UK part of the European Union, like we're allies-ish, mm-hmm. And then that is Russia's stance to China. So they're both competing with each other and working with each other, but they have interest in expanding markets. And I know now I'm going to get all the like Xi defenders, out of nowhere, and particularly talking to me about how China is socialist or something. But they need a market advantage, particularly as China does have a developing middle class. You know, it's not just. It still has a Gini coefficient that's insane, and it has rural poverty that is ignored by even the Western media. But it is developing. Like when we talk about like all the poverty that capitalism has lifted people out of, the biggest example of that is the control state capitalism of China. Mm-hmm. That like India's growth has been much more anemic, even though it does exist. And then Central America has grown, but again, anemically and largely dependent on its trade with the United States. So yeah. Now, what I've been hearing from people in Spanish-speaking countries that AMLO is not handling this coronavirus effect very well either. So who knows what the developing world is going to see? But we are seeing the fundamental weaknesses of the reliance on the public-private partnerships in not just the United States. All right, we're seeing this. Italy is where these pig countries in the EU are going to be particularly vulnerable because they have a weak state sector and always have. But if the reports I'm hearing out of the Nordic countries are true too, you're seeing breakdowns across the board. So European soft social democracy, which has somewhat neoliberalized in the last 20 years itself, but nowhere near to the extent the United States and the UK have, also isn't able to handle this. And
scary.
Yeah. And while Asian nations it's been Asian nations with high populations and small, and much more controlled borders, and maybe China, but it has radically changed China in ways we don't even fully understand yet.
So, in regards to coronavirus, do you think this is like putting sort of this globalized neoliberalism sort of to the test finally?
Yeah. I think the globalization part of neoliberalism maybe you're going to see a refocus on national supply chains. Mm-hmm. And for a while, that's going to look like economies are going to build up again after this. It's going to look like that initial boom probably after World War I. Mm-hmm. Once we get through this, there's going to be a massive crash. I mean, people forget before the Great Depression, we were in a depression at the end of, in the teens too. Mm-hmm. Spanish flu was not good. It's just you saw, all the new markets created. There's all these black markets created from prohibition that affected the economy. I mean, there's all kinds of stuff involved. A lot of that stuff is gone. Another thing that we have to look at is like the traditional method in neoliberalism to handle crises has been monetarism, mm-hmm. which is not as disrelated from Keynesianism as people think. It is an idea that controlling interest rates and keeping liquidity primed can avoid the worst effects of the business cycle. All right. Mm-hmm. So it's not Keynesianism. It's not about putting people to work and giving people consumption money, but it is about keeping credit going. Mm-hmm. We're almost out of that. Mm-hmm. All we can do, we can't fix stock shocks with interest rates anymore. We now have to do it with low interest mm-hmm. loans or no interest loans and direct monetary injections. Mm-hmm. If you do too much of that and the world market gets spooked, well, what do you got? Also, with oil being the way it is for everybody, we might have an issue with the petrodollar. Mm-hmm. It might not matter that like the renminbi can't be a reserve currency to compete with the dollar anymore. Mm-hmm. Because it might not be as relevant for anybody.
So, in layman's terms, what does this portend for the future? Fair enough. People who just said there's going to be a massive crash. I mean, it sounds like dark times ahead.
In the immediate future, probably. What we're going to see in the immediate future is there will probably be more federal injections to spike up the trade, and it'll probably work. But every analyst I'm reading says that we're going to see high volatility and a return to rapid fire changes between boom and bust.
on the stock market. How long other markets such as the crypto market or the bond market don't react, we don't know. Before the bonds are going down again, but before the injection of the Fed money, bonds were no longer, usually they work invertedly to stocks. They weren't. They were also down at a time where they shouldn't have been. All right, which that's a sign of serious problems. Also, if we're really socially isolated and not going out in our highly service economy for a long time, expanded unemployment and 14 days of paid, of federally reinforced sick leave will not keep the economy afloat. Mm-hmm. You're going to see municipalities and states have to pass moratoriums on evictions, which they're not going to be able to pay for. So for a while, that'll just seem good, but then there won't be anything to cover it up. You're going to see right now there's a freeze in credit interest in federally owned or it's unclear what Trump actually meant by this, but student loans you still have to pay on them, but they're not collecting interest for the immediate future. Mm-hmm. If they're federally backed, I think. So it doesn't apply to private loans. I'm not sure it applies to unsubsidized federal loans. That was unclear from the way Trump stated it, and I haven't read the order. Mm-hmm. So that'll help a little bit in that you'll be paying more to principal, but since it probably won't change your minimum payment very much unless you're only paying interest. That's a very that was a weird. I was like, why do that now? Mm-hmm. So we're all those things are just being delayed. Mm-hmm. So if you see major service sector collapses, you're going to see an uptick in unemployment and an uptick of stuff like what we saw with the housing crisis, mm-hmm. But for a different reason.
It's interesting. I've seen some people trying to spin this pandemic in their own politically positive way. I mean, the main thing I've seen is I think I saw someone yesterday claim that, coronavirus is like a natural shock doctrine that will bring about social democracy. I'm not nearly as hopeful about that.
Everyone may be a socialist in a pandemic while the pandemic's going on. But you haven't seen social democracy really pivot towards it either. I mean, if you look at the countries that really handled this well, they're not highly social democratic. They're kind of highly authoritarian. Mm-hmm. I mean, Singapore is not like the biggest social democratic stronghold in the world. Neither is South Korea. Mm-hmm. So what do you got?
Right. No, I see what you're saying there. I think that's a good counter argument. I guess the only other thing I wanted to cover was, unless there's anything else you want to say about coronavirus, I wanted to talk just briefly about the elections and Trump.
All right. Sure. I mean, I can rant about coronavirus all day, I guess, more about our inability to deal with it. The only thing I'd tell people is don't panic. It's not like an Uber plague, particularly if you're younger. But even if you are younger, you can get sick from it. And you can definitely get people who are immunocompromised or are older in your life sick from it. Mm-hmm. Take that shit seriously. And also, even a mild case still sucks. A mild case is still foreseeably pneumonia. If you've ever had bacterial or viral pneumonia, it's not fun. That does not normally come off to you as a mild disease. Mm-hmm. So those are my only two coronavirus things. Also, I'm not sure that toilet paper is produced in China, so you don't have to hoard it. But we're literally doing bank runs on toilet paper. Like the fact that we're hoarding it is causing further hoarding patterns. Mm-hmm. Of all the things. It's
I was trying to say about coronavirus that everyone trying to immediately move out of the city is probably a bad idea.
No, you'll spread it to the countryside.
Okay, so I'm not I'm not wrong about that, because other people have said, oh, well, you would want to go to the less densely populated area. And I'm like, but you're probably spreading it.
Well,
quarantine.
If you do not have a lot of outbreaks in your area and you go like today,
Mm-hmm.
and you haven't been exposed to many people, yeah, actually it might not be a bad idea. But if you've been exposed at all, like you've gone through an airport or whatever, like you're risking spreading it, particularly if you're in a place like New York. Like you can just bring it further out. Because even if you're going to develop symptoms, this is contagious before it's symptomatic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you may not show any symptoms for the first 14 days. That's my understanding.
Yep, 2 to 14 days for it to incubate.
That's pretty scary.
That's why the initial quarantine for, like, if you suspect is self-quarantine for suspected exposure is still 2 weeks, because like they're gonna see, like, that's if you can't test, the only way to know is like, okay, I was exposed. If I wait and nothing shows up in 2 weeks,
Mm-hmm.
then I'm not spreading it to anyone.
Right. So, moving from coronavirus, I guess this ties in. A lot of people, especially Democrats, are saying, well, this is the end of the Trump presidency. There is no way that he is going to win in November. The only person I've seen question that is maybe Matthew Iglesias a little bit, which it's weird because I find myself agreeing with Matthew Iglesias on rather small details lately, and it sort of scares me.
Well, Matthew Iglesias I think he's a ghoul, but Matthew Iglesias and Jonathan Chait are so concerned about the future of the Democratic Party in the long run that they tend to not buy into short run myths. All right. Mm-hmm. Even though they are both centrist ghouls. Mm-hmm. And I think that should be really like absorbed a little bit. Mm-hmm. Do I think Trump is going to win in November? I would say my odds are against him because he has handled this so incompetently. But if this doesn't stretch out, it probably won't stick. Mm-hmm. If it stretches out, it will.
Well, I mean, so what Iglesias was saying is, if the media and the state governments and civil society are able to pull off the miraculous and, basically contain this thing, Trump's either going to take credit or say, aha, fake news.
Yeah, I think
that could benefit him if this does not go on into the November elections.
I think that's completely true.
Mm-hmm.
But I also don't really think that's likely to happen.
Mm-hmm. You think it's going to last for quite a while?
I don't know if quite a while, but I don't think I can't see us. Like I have trouble seeing us getting it contained to South Korea levels, since it's also happening in multiple areas. The other difference between South Korea had outbreaks in other places, but it was mostly concentrated in Daegu, which is not its biggest city and is also surrounded by mountains and fairly easy to isolate. I lived in Korea for 2 years. I know Korea. For us, it's in our hubs. Okay, Washington State, maybe. But it's in every state but 3 now. Because we've now had an outbreak in Idaho. We've now had an outbreak in Maine, at least one person. Mm-hmm. All right? And they're not necessarily travel-related anymore. Mm-hmm. The travel restrictions may stop bringing it in, but honestly, it seems like too little too late. And we haven't had internal travel restrictions since the Civil War. Mm-hmm. We're not going to know what that's going to really look like. Not massive.
Do you think that's where we're headed towards?
Well, Trump is considering it.
Mm-hmm.
That really will stop that will trigger an economic crisis.
Right.
You have declines in interstate commerce, not just intra-country commerce, which is bad enough. Mm-hmm. So if those things happen, then I don't see how Trump wins the next election if we have it. Mm-hmm. I don't know what presidential powers could be assumed. Mm-hmm. I actually am not one of those people who thinks a Trump coup is likely, but I'm also.
Is that possible? Is that possible? That
yes, it is possible under martial law to suspend elections. We've never done it.
That's a scary thought.
It's possible under martial law to suspend habeas corpus, remember? That we have done. So yeah. I mean, we're not under martial law. Stanford Act doesn't invoke martial law, but like, honestly, it's one of the few things that I think, like, this is what a mass pandemic, if you have like a few million deaths, which do the math, even if you're at the 1% rate and you're at 80% infectivity, you're going to approach a few million deaths. Yeah.
So before we wrap up, I guess we have to talk a little bit about the left, because you are the host of the Pop the Left.
Yeah, I'm the co-host, but yes.
Co-host with the great Doug Lane, the great Marxo-Gnostic. So what do you make of where the left goes from here post Bernie? And I want to comment real quick. I was reading, I think you posted it. There was a BuzzFeed article recently entitled, I think it was by Ruby Kramer, entitled something like the day Bernie realized he lost, or the weekend Bernie realized he lost the vote. That was probably one of the most humanizing things I've read about Bernie Sanders, to be honest. It seems like he was a true believer in what he was doing, but I think there were a lot of mistakes made along the way. I don't know if that's the impression you get. I know a lot of people will say he's just a sheepdog, but
I don't know. I think there's a lot of mistakes along the way. I think the biggest thing is that something I've been warning about for years is over focusing on the executive prematurely before other levers of the Democratic Party have been assumed by people sympathetic to Bernie, and making it more about Bernie than about the social democratic movement. Doing that for Corbyn, where Corbyn legitimately had more power than Bernie ever did, was disastrous for that wing of the Labour Party. And,
well, I mean, especially when you turn people like Bernie and Corbyn into like messianic figures, it does not end well for movements to do that.
No, but they have a tendency to do it. So the DSA did not really build itself as a parent institution in a real way to provide real services to compete with the Democratic Party in certain key functions. There's still no workers' movement to really speak of to replace this. There has been an uptick in unionization. If we're in a recession, that's probably going to stop. A slow growth recovery is somewhat ideal for unionization for two reasons. The conditions of workers do not go up dramatically during the growth, which causes resentment, but employment does. So minimum employment reduces the absolute desperation of the scab, but you can see enough in social inequities where you need to unionize. Now, we have two problems. One, service sector areas do not function the same way as ultra-industrial unions, and we haven't figured out how to make it function, and Taft-Hartley still exist. Obama didn't even keep his promise on card check, much less anything reducing Taft-Hartley and politicized union organizing. And yes, unions are parapolitical actors, but they're parapolitical actors. They can't politically strike. You can't do a general strike in the United States legally. Now you can wildcat it, but there's not been enough movement to do so. So you don't have a large institutionalized workers movement to pull from and create a workers' party out of, which is traditionally where they came out of, was concretized interrelated union movements. That is why Taft-Hartley exists, to make sure that there was not a real workers' party in the United States. And no, the Democrats do not count as a workers' party.
I was going to ask about that next, actually. Do you think...
No.
You read my mind now.
Go ahead, ask the question.
Well, I was going to ask about. I was reading a comment by Jeffrey St. Clair right after the results of the last moment in the primaries happened, and St. Clair is, of course, from Counterpunch for people that don't know, and he said, it's time to cut the cord. Bernie couldn't get through with the Democrats, and we're now seeing Bidenism. Maybe it's time to cut the cord. In other words, he's saying you're not going to get the Democrats to change. I'm wondering what you think of that. I think you're probably sympathetic to it.
I am sympathetic to it, but there's a lot of things to look at. Like, so I might protest vote for Howie Hawkins because I'm in a Ruby red state. If you're in a non-swing state, always vote your conscience, right? For the joint SP-USA green ticket. Do I think it's ideal? No, but Hawkins seems okay.
I think Hawkins is going to prove very interesting if he can reorganize the Greens. I know a lot of people are talking about and trying to convince Hawkins that the Green Party should focus more on using his campaign to capture local elections where they're most likely to maybe have a chance of winning.
Right.
And I actually don't think that's a bad strategy.
The issue that is, though, and I'm going to get into a little bit of history here, and I'm going to quote, I quoted Ingalls today. Ingalls said that the class instability in the United States led to the ability to placate proletarians with injections of stolen land. He didn't call it stolen, but we know what it is. Created this ability for there to be so many different interests within the bourgeois class, and the working class could kind of attach onto it because it's either going to get land or now stocks to keep people involved in speculation, and thus there'd be no need for a workers' party. By the time it could have developed in the United States was around the 1950s, but then we passed a law which Taft-Hartley, which kept it from happening. So then, what about the other third-party strategies? While the parties are private organizations that do not have any constitutional mandate and have no legal restrictions other than as private organizations, at the federal level, they are often written into law at the state level. That will be very hard to get around.
I see.
So often, like, the bars to entry, for a candidate into an election is much higher for a third-party candidate than someone with the legally already prescriptive imprimatur of the Democrats and the Republicans.
Do you think there's... Go on.
So that strategy could work, but it'll take 100 years.
Do you think there's any chance of working within the Democratic Party, but not at the presidential level?
So ideally what you'd have is something like the Green Party, and also non-political parties. This is another thing. We're still too focused in many ways on political parties. Non-political party, non-NGO institutions, and it's hard to imagine in the United States what it still looks like outside of unions, but something like unions, to put pressure on a segment of the Democratic Party while also having a party that is closer to a socialist or a labor party outside of it running local elections, who's willing to challenge the Democratic Party and risk losing to Republicans if need be to pressure it. Because the thing that has structurally hampered leftists within the Democratic Party is that Democrats are more scared of their opposition than Republicans are. Republicans will risk loss for different factions to take over the party. And they have. Democrats have not done that since the Dixiecrats. So, in modern political memory. There are class reasons for this too. Like if you look at historically, the Republicans are the party of industrial business and the Democrats are the party of like landed property. That changed in the middle of the 20th century, where the Democrats are now kind of the party of finance, and the Republicans are kind of the party of industrial business and the more conservative areas of finance. Which means the Democratic base is a populist base without clear concessions, and there are internal contradictions between them, as I've mentioned, between the Latino vote are the black vote, even the black vote within the black vote, like the young black vote versus the old black vote. Like they're very, very different things. The Republicans also have a much cleaner demographic they serve and have been playing local games with rural politics with smaller groups for a lot longer than the Democrats have. Democrats have relied on urban machines again since the 60s, particularly since they lost the Dixie Cross in the South. And pretty much handed what little bit was left of those machines either to Republicans or to Democrats of color in cities usually. Which those machines are actually like small c structurally conservative. So you'd need an inside outside approach that was willing to work with people within the Democratic Party who'd be willing to take risks. And no Democrat, including AOC, is really willing to do it. Not even Bernie. Bernie's not really willing to say he will not endorse Biden. And
right. Well, he's made it clear he's going to endorse Biden.
Clearly, then, at this point, he actually is staying in, I think, to keep Demexit from happening. Even though he doesn't really trust the Democrats himself. Because he's afraid of losing to Trump. Now, that, the other thing I keep telling people that only a few people have really grounded, but you actually do understand this, you brought it up too, Trump doesn't need the popular vote. Now, Republicans, except for, let's see, the last two Republican presidents did not win the popular vote the first time and were able to squeak it out barely the second time. Or, well, that was the last one. And then so we don't know the second time with Trump. And the squeaking out barely the second time is with Bush, and we tend to see Reagan in terms of his second term victory, but we have to remember in '83 people were predicting he was going to lose. The historical advantage to incumbency is huge. Plus all that Trump has to do is maintain his current coalition and not lose the Midwestern state. Even if he only has like 46% of the vote, he can do that. So what do you do? Like that's a structural thing. So you have to the other thing is Democrats have to really start running in rural areas, or a third party would have to do that. Something like Bernie actually did in Vermont. Remember, Vermont was a ruby red state in the 80s. I mean, so Bernie does have experience with this, but only in his regional area. And also, he didn't run as a Democrat, but there's other structural reasons why that would have been easier to do in Vermont than in some other states. So I guess the long and short of it is you need all hands on deck and multiple strategies coordinating through something other than a party to get that to happen in the U.S. because you need major electoral reforms. Not just ranked choice voting, although that'd be great. No one quick trick will do it. Not just when the Jacobin people get really ambitious, abolish the Senate. I'm you have to even redraw state boundaries and kill state governments and stuff. You have to be really radical for that stuff to truly work. Otherwise, you gotta have you'd have to grow a party that can really hold local elections, and that as a threat from local elections could force Democratic candidates in a caucus to work with them or not. There is not a good model for that because we're not a parliamentary system. We're a presidential system, and presidential systems have a tendency to encourage something that looks like executive overreach, even when the executives don't have power in that area. So, in short, there's no easy way. We have to build institutions, and we're going to have to. We have to be willing to both oppose the Democratic Party and work with them at the same time, and that's a very hard position to be in.
Last thing, you mentioned Dem exit. Everything seems like a catch-22 at this point because I understand the arguments about harm reduction and vote blue because it will get Trump, the chaos president, out.
But that's been that argument can't be made from every president since Nixon.
Yeah, well, yeah.
Right? I mean, so eventually you have to be willing to risk the loss. Now, okay, the other thing go ahead.
I was just going to say the thing I find frustrating is so I've been supportive of Bernie, and what I was told immediately after Biden started winning was, the youth didn't come out to vote, screw them. And this goes back to Clinton. I believe Clinton even said in 2016, if you don't like the way the Democratic Party is, leave. Mm-hmm. I think Biden has expressed similar sentiments when he tells, immigration activists critical of his critical of the Obama administration's immigration policies. He says, go vote for Trump. Or when he says, if you want to end fracking, go vote for another party. Don't vote for me. I don't care. So I'm getting this message from a lot of Democrats that, you progressives or you leftists, just get out, leave. We don't need you. We'll get the election through the suburban vote. But then when you hold them to that, they're like, no, please vote for vote blue no matter who. So it's like
that double message actually makes sense. It is a mindfuck, but it's kind of gaslighting. But it's also something they could do, because what they're telling you is, you leave, but what other choice do you have? Mm-hmm. And you're not slowly building up that other choice. Now, and I know everyone's like, oh, we got to fight right now. So that's what, but that sense of urgency is actually disempowering. Yes, things are urgent, but you can't, like, barring true collapse, you don't have any levers to pull in an urgent situation that doesn't empower the people who are already in charge. Mm-hmm. Unless you start building those levers for yourself. And Bernie, in a way, has helped with this, but he's also, in a way, hurt it. I've never been one of those people who I was always a Bernie skeptic, but I was never one of those people who was like, oh, just don't deal with electoralism at all. Because I'm like, well, no, healthcare is worth fighting for. And I'm not an immiseration thesis person or an impossibilist. And for your listeners who don't know what that is, immiseration thesis is the idea that absolute poverty radicalized people. Historically speaking, there's actually no evidence for that. And the impossibilist is like, hey, have the reformists win so that when it fails, we'll have revolution. There's also no evidence for that. Usually that actually cuts right wing. Mm-hmm. But those are the arguments for, like, bad faith or no support for Sanders. What I wanted was, if it was possible for Sanders to win, yes, he would probably fail, but maybe this movement would create, if he won, there would maybe space created by Medicare for All would be good. And then, like, the existence of these institutions to support Bernie would start to lead to para-institutions. However, that even I realized that was a big hope, because even from, like, left liberals under Obama were hoping to do that with Obama's, campaign orgs and to turn them into, like, change.org and all that stuff. None of that stuff ended up mattering. It was all absorbed into the Democratic machine, because Obama actually appointed all his leadership from the prior Democratic machine, which is actually very different than what Clinton did and needs to be noted. Mm-hmm. Clinton didn't go to all the old hats and put them in power. He brought up people from Arkansas and then people in his new Democratic Leadership Council coalition and stuff like that. Not, Mondale Humphreys people.
Do you think? Well, go on. Sorry.
No, I mean, so just from, like, bourgeois politics, from a political perspective, Obama, like, did not build his own leadership class. That's why you're stuck with Biden as, like, the counter establishment to the Clinton wing. Mm-hmm. But Biden was picked because he wasn't really a threat.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting. That leads into something I was going to mention. I've heard some people say, actually it was Jeffrey St. Clair again, was saying Bidenism is going to be even worse than Clintonism. It's even more right-wing. I don't know how you feel about that sentiment, though. I haven't really thought about it
It would depend on the pressure from. I think Biden's like Mitt Romney. He's kind of a suit. So, like,
yeah, I'm not sure Biden believes in much of anything.
Like, I think Biden can be very, very, very right wing and has been on the right side of the Democratic issues even more than the Clinton wing has. But he's also been on the left side of certain issues. Remember, he was to the left of Obama on cultural issues because he couldn't keep his mouth shut. Mm. So it's really hard to know. I'm more worried about the fact that he seems to be cracking under pressure right now. Mm-hmm. And if he let's not see, to me, I'm not so much worried about Trump continuing to win. What I'm worried about is what happens when you get a Democrat who inherits a broken economy, the aftermath of a pandemic, but not on, like Obama kind of did, but without Obama's 2-year Democratic power base, and in a much more hostile political environment, with maybe the U.S. not in as strong a geopolitical position and with as many allies.
It's almost like Trump having another 4 years.
Right.
Almost, I don't want to sound like an accelerationist, but maybe him having this burden on him, the coming crash, would end up being good for the opposition.
It's hard to know.
Mm-hmm. We're in the wilderness of mirrors.
Yeah. Like I don't want to, I'm not an accelerationist or an impossibilist or an administration theorist, but I actually don't know what the Democrats are going to do. Because I don't know what policy levers they really have either, particularly the Biden wing of it. But I mean, Bernie would have faced similar problems, which is something that I was concerned when other people weren't. Like, oh, you have a socialist president who inherits this, and then they can blame socialism for why the economy is still down. The other thing is, Trumpism is not a coherent thing other than it's whatever Trump thinks it is, and a lot of conspiracy theories and random shit. What does it look like when you have someone like with a Steve Bannon vision who's not as drunk as Steve Bannon was and way more competent than Trump?
That's very, very scary to even consider.
Right. Like, and someone who maybe doesn't cave to McConnell in the same way.
Mm-hmm. Do you think there's anyone like that coming up through the ranks, though?
Not right now, but we don't know what the future of GOP is going to look like.
That's fair enough. That's fair enough.
It is moving further and further rightward. I mean, Alex Jones level conspiracy theory stuff is no longer as outside of the box as it used to be.
Mm-hmm. I guess what I was getting at is like these elements of the very, very far right, the sort of traditionalist Catholic, but really we're just white nationalist sort of side of things. They're utterly incompetent. And yeah, you knew exactly who I was talking about.
Nick Fuentes is not actually incompetent as a spoiler. He is very good at pointing out like the weakness of something like Talking Points USA. Honestly, on the left, we could do someone who'd be willing to burn stuff down like that. But
who said the same thing? Paul Gottfried said the same thing about Nick Fuentes. He likes the kid. Tells you a lot.
Yeah, but that's not going to build up a political movement in any positive sense, and they're not competent to do that.
Right.
And so right now, all you have is negative competency and that really radical fringe. And then like the other part of the white nationalist movement is just pathetic. I mean, like, so it was shown to be pathetic very quickly, ironically, by Trump's victory. And they also hate Trump now.
Yeah, so, I've noticed that a lot lately. They are not happy with Trump.
Like people who have more, a lot of the more radicals that people thought were more on Trump's side are not so. But if once you've seen this in Europe, eventually you get someone competent.
Mm-hmm.
Like you don't always have like obvious trash Nazis.
You get a Le Pen.
Yeah, or a Jobbik.
Right.
Or like we haven't had that, and there's reasons why we haven't had it in the U.S. structural reasons, but like eventually there's going to be somebody who comes out of the wings, particularly if Trump has created a pattern where non-politicos can really come in.
Mm-hmm.
Because yes, most of them have been a joke. Most of them have been a Ben Carsons of the world, but. Mm-hmm. They're not always going to be.
That's a fair point to consider. I guess in closing, I would be remiss if I didn't ask. How do you feel about the EU? It seems to be coming apart at the seams.
Good.
I knew you were going to say that.
I've been a Eurosceptic for a long time. Now, I was not a Brexit supporter. I wasn't a Lexit supporter either, because how it does. Like, I think international institutions are good, but I think the EU is transparently a fairly undemocratic, neoliberal regulatory agency that has created a lot of problems for Europeans and them not being able to control their monetary policy. I don't think, though, that control of monetary policy would have, like, say Greece or Italy from their current problems. Mm-hmm. But it does create an inflexibility, just like it does for the states. I mean, imagine if California could print its own money, mm-hmm. Which that's both good and terrifying. So, like, somewhat similarly with those European countries. But the EU has been so aggressive recently in how it's mishandled things. It's hard to imagine how it continues to go forward. However, not united, Europe is no longer relevant. Mm-hmm. Europe is only relevant on the world stage as a united bloc. Mm-hmm. No individual power in Europe, other than Germany and France and the UK, which is no longer part of it, really has a whole lot of singular economic power enough to really float the kind of things the EU can as a bloc. So that's not great for them, but the popular anger at what's happened is only going to increase. But
you think much is going to happen with Scotland and Ireland now?
Who knows?
Fair enough.
The suppression of referendums is going to be consistent but hard to do. Ireland is a different deal because the Good Friday Accords actually gives them the right to have a referendum in a way mm-hmm. that Northern Ireland than the way that Scotland does not have. Mm-hmm. So yes, the Northern. I do see the possibility of Northern Ireland leaving the UK. I don't know that it'll be able to join the EU. It might join a united. I mean, it'll probably opt to join the United Ireland, and then who knows beyond that point, because the EU problems are not going to go away just because Northern Ireland is part of that bloc. And I don't think Northern Ireland cares so much about access to the EU as much as it cares about access to Ireland, which is why it cares about access to the EU.
In closing, you mentioned para-institutions. I guess there's the idea of counter.
Yeah.
What's that?
Para-state institutions, yes.
Right. Para-state institutions, counter-institutions. I hear a lot of talk about that these days. But I wonder, like, if we even have the ability to imagine such things anymore. Maybe
militias and unions are your first step.
What's that?
Militias and unions are your first step.
That's very interesting that you mentioned that. I've been saying that about militias lately. It's been odd seeing militias working with, like, Black Lives Matter and Antifa activists lately. Yeah, I mean,
the abandonment of militias because of their association with right wingers was never really super smart. I don't think a militia is going to overthrow the government, but, like, having sympathetic armed wings of things is not necessarily a bad deterrent, because, you know, people don't want Wacos all the time. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I mean, that's a big deal. Those are para institutions, particularly if they have formalized structures and are not run by, like, wingnut cult leaders. You also need mutual aid societies that do more things than NGOs. Those are really hard because they need money or people. And you normally get those through unions. So the unions have to be built up first. The problem is the unions under the auspices of the AFL-CIO are highly bureaucratized. There's all kinds of internal problems. You don't just bring that union movement back up. There's a reason why, like, radical unions call them business unions, et cetera, and so forth. Like, there's issues there. it's very hard to deal with in a very clear way, traditionally speaking. The other issue is the largest unionized sectors are not, they deal with state are professional interests. So like nurses, teachers. Traditionally, these are guild unions, and they actually tend to be somewhat conservative and up times to protect their own special benefits. You see this with like public workers unions in like say New York, who will oppose Bernie Sanders because they oppose universal health care because they have really awesome health care packages because their bargaining power and no one else does. And so they would lose their ability to attract people to the union because they can't do that anymore. That is not common to unions, but it does really happen. And in Marxist world we call that labor aristocratic unionism. But it's a real structural incentive, particularly when another thing that's happened to the unions is the old auto unions favored seniority so much that they actually disincentivize future membership and hurt their younger workers in a way that the younger workers didn't feel loyal to them, like in the auto crash. And that's not as relevant anymore. But the other major problem they come into is the current business union models. A lot of their leadership is not from rank and file people who are paid by dues, they're paid by stock options. And their primary goal is to lobby. So they funnel a lot of dues money directly into lobbyists' hands. That's not a great way to organize union stuff. There have been moves in the AFL-CIO to kind of move away from this, but that's been their model for like 60 years. So
I like that you mention the material interests that go into these things, because I was having an argument recently, and then I promise I'll let you go after this comment or whatever. I noticed a lot of like younger leftists talking about like reevaluating the history of the boomers and saying things like, oh, if you really look at how they wore the hippie generation, they were really about selfishness, and they just didn't want to go to war, and they wanted to have sex and do drugs all the time.
That's stupid.
Well, let me finish.
All right.
So my response to that is you're assuming that they have idealistic reasons for doing what they do. Boomers have an investment in this system. There's probably more boomers than there are. I mean, there's definitely more boomers than there are millennials and Gen Z that own homes.
Well, okay,
they have material interests ultimately, and it's not about their ideals.
So let's talk about a few things, like structurally speaking. Boomers who don't have pensions are invested into the stock market as their primary means of income. So it's not about ideals there either. They're literally they have to, for material reasons. They're subject to the scraps of capital, but they're not getting wages anymore for the most part, unless they currently still work. And if they currently still work, they tend to be in management. So, that tends to have a conservatizing effect.
Exactly.
Very proletarian boomers are, very poor retirees and stuff. They also tend to be real laborers. They tend to be sympathetic, right? There's just not a lot of them, and they tend to die because they're more subject to the things that kill people, like lack of insurance. So they don't live as long. So there's that problem too. And the other thing you have to remember about the boomers is the boomers in the United States in particular are literally the richest generation that ever existed on the planet in human history, period, end of discussion. So while I don't really buy generational political stuff or anything other than cultural changes, I do think there are cultural changes that go along with technology. I don't think they're ideological.
Well, I mean, I get why millennials and Gen Z feel very angry with boomers right now. I just don't think any of this has to do with idealism. I think idealism is BS, and I think material forces drive much more than ideals ever did.
Yeah, I think it's a lot of it. And I think there's probably more sympathetic boomers out there than we realize who lost all of their savings in the last recession and barely made them back up. They exist. But they're not a huge chunk.
The ones that aren't, they're hanging on for dear life. I think the 2008 really messed with a lot of boomer minds, I think.
Right. So you have this sense of desperation on some boomers and this ultimate ease that they've had for years. And again, materially speaking, the people who generated from the white, particularly white people who benefited from the post-50s boom, were literally the richest generation in human history. Mm-hmm. So of course they're going to be clawing stuff back for dear life, but they also, unfortunately, we set all of our norms based off cultural myths that really only existed for maybe 20 years. Between 1946, not really even then, really not till the 1950s, but until 1946 to 1965, and only if you're white. That's when everyone's norm of what everything is was set. Mm-hmm. And that was never realistic. Mm-hmm. And I'm not saying we need realism again. I just think that's why this is so hard. That's why there's so much resentment. But also why there's kind of a deep conservatism for material reasons. Yes, boomers own homes. Yes, boomers who don't own homes are still probably highly invested in the stock market. So they have to have the stock market work, even if they don't like the bastards. It doesn't matter. Boomers don't have to fight wars very much anymore. They've already lost a lot of their people to the people who did in their generation. I mean, the whole they were selfish hippies. I would have wanted to stay at home and have sex and not go to get blown off for no reason too, particularly to support an imperial project that had no, come on. That's silly.
Well, they also weren't really the ones behind things that we give them credit for either.
No.
Everyone talks about the boomers and civil rights. And I'm the leadership wasn't boomer.
They were lost generation. The rank and file were boomers of color. Another thing is, believe it or not, opposition to the war, particularly in the beginning of the war, was less amongst the young and more amongst the middle-aged who remember the Korean War and World War II. This is a fact that's largely lost on people, but it wasn't at the time. It was that the hippies were more, the oppositional hippies were more willing to get press than the older leadership who are more willing to use them. But I think this 68, 69 myth from Europe and America also plays into this. Because a lot of the left, as much as I hate the boomers, they're base example if it's not 1914 or 1917, which has very little relevance to their lives and is kind of cosplaying. In fact, I was reading Marx's Brumaire of Louis Napoleon, and he talks about how revolutionaries tend to do this cosplay in the last revolution because they're not willing to take the risk for the future, and because it can hide the content or lack of content of what they believe in. And he was talking about, but I mean, I see it in the way a lot of these people play Act 1917. But the other model that we had was the boomer model, 68 model, which wasn't really effective even in France. I mean, it produced Mitterrand, and if you actually know French politics, that's not something to be proud of. So I guess the long and short of it is, yeah, it's material conditions, and yeah, also I think we never really understood the boomers in the first place. If there are good books on how the boomers were not just generationally not the leaders of civil rights, the people involved in civil rights were a minority. Even then, most people were apolitical or slightly conservative. Boomers were part of a religious revivalism that was much larger than the prior generation. And we forgot about that too. That still plays in, that plays into a lot of what's going on now. And the other thing is all this paranoia has been a boomer tendency since Vietnam. It cut left wing at first, then cut right wing. But in the 80s was part of just popular general culture.
Well, the thing is, I don't think any of this conspiratorial paranoia is new to America. We had it in the earliest stages of this country. There was a panic in New England in the early days of the Republic about the Illuminati was invading New England. And then you go and you have the Know Nothing Party, which, you can see the parallels to anti-immigration Trumpism. You had Richard Hofstadter writing about the paranoid style in American politics in the 20th century. None of this is new.
Also, I also think that people underestimate the paranoia in other places. Mm-hmm. It's actually worse in other places in a lot of cases.
Do you remember the 90s when everyone in the sort of media establishment were worried about fusion paranoia and complaining about stuff like Feral House? None of this is new.
Yeah, I know. And it's not unique to the U.S. either.
Right.
That's the other thing. The U.S. is, we have our own special form of things because we're kind of sort of the tallest man standing, even though we're like bleeding everywhere. But then so is everybody else, which is something that people don't talk about. So we continue to be the hegemon of diminished and declining and regressed expectations. And I don't see that immediately changing. I do see, like, China is, I think, very strong in some ways, but more like it can also break easily. And its leaders know it. And that's why they're trying not to make our mistakes, but they're still doing some of the same stuff we did in, say, Africa, and leading to massive backlash. So, I mean, and, the other thing about the idealism of all these generations, and this has been an American trait for a while, but it's just a trait in general, is our own exceptionalism also tends to flip on itself and lead to this, like, we must, if we're not uniquely good, we must still be special in human history because we're uniquely evil. And yes, in some ways, because of the time we live in, there's so much power, we are uniquely evil. But there's nothing about the character of the United States. It's about the character of power. So, and one of the things that having lived in, like, developing countries, one of the things I was shocked in is how, like, the noblesse oblige of American power is actually still pretty strong. Like, they hide from us, and while they're totally awful in some ways, they're not blatant about it in public. It's not true everywhere else. So, I tend to think, yes, the American empire is declining, but no, I don't think we live in, like, this multipolar world where, like, Russia and China are going to rush up and be the new hegemons in some kind of bilateral, because A, Russia's not that powerful, and B, China's a more complicated situation than people realize, both its detractors and its supporters. So,
all I have to say is that I completely agree with you. We need to move on from 1968, and grad students need to stop reading Deleuze because he was just probably a fucking reactionary if it wasn't for Guattari. And please, people, stop reading fucking Deleuze, especially if you're a grad school student. That's not going to happen anytime soon, though, probably.
Also, if you're a grad student, quit assuming you can speak for the working class.
Well, even if a very good point.
Even if you're from it. Like, I was from the working class, and when I was in grad school, I probably would have said the most idiotic stuff about my own background. So, like, chill out. I think the last thing we need to do is, I do think we need some epistemic humility right now, because we keep on proving to ourselves that we're wrong, and because we believed in our own bullshit so thoroughly, we can't be intellectually nimble enough to try to follow material interests and stuff in new ways, particularly now that we're in real crises. I mean, it's not just the Steven Pinkers of the world who've been told to eat it. It's, a lot of the countercultural people have too. And we have to keep that sort of intellectual nimbleness in approaching these things. Like, I'm an ideologue in a lot of ways, but I realize I don't know the answers to a lot of these problems. I can just see trends. And I have a way of understanding, conceptualizing those trends. But I don't know what the future is going to be. I do not know that we're going to be in a neoliberal hellscape or some kind of, like, diminished expectation social democracy. I don't know any of that, and no one else does either. And when history starts accelerating fast, like it has been the last year, you have to be even more skeptical. Like, every week, everybody's been wrong about everything. So, I feel very differently making calls. Maybe this is age, maybe this is expertise speaking, but I had a very good track record of making political calls until, like, 2016. And even then, I was not as like, oh, Trump will never win, as a lot of other people were. I'd never said that. I didn't think it was likely. But when you look at things now, I'm like, we don't know what's going on. Like, so much is happening so fast, and, like, it's like trying to predict
more black swans, right?
Yeah, it's as much as I don't like Nissam Talib's, like, economics, like, his stuff about not know, like you can't assume that that the status quo will remain in equilibrium for very long on anything. You don't know the emergence of highly complex systems.
Well, hey, C. Derick Varn, I want to thank you for coming on Parallax Views.
All right.